Greetings, Earthlings. Today we're going to go over the Z or railroad track setup. Now, what is that about? That'll just be our little mnemonic or memory trick to learn all this stuff. So what is all this stuff? Vertical angles, alternate interior angles, corresponding angles, alternate exterior angles, and while we're at it, the terms complementary and supplementary. So I just want to start with two high-level points and then we'll go through these little details. So math, just like English or Chinese or French or whatever, is a language. So it's not all that it is, but it is a language. So what does that mean? I'll be honest, when I had to learn all these terms, I found it pretty annoying. So I just wanted to emphasize math is not about learning these terms. That said, if you don't know them, they're going to restrict you. So it's best to just learn them really quickly, get it out of the way, and never have to really go back to that, unless you forgot something. So to learn a language, you need to know the alphabet, right? So learning the ABC is not very fun, but you can't read or do much in the English language if you don't know your ABCs. Same thing. This is sort of your ABCs. If you don't know what a vertical angle, what a pair of vertical angles is, then you just don't know your ABCs in math. So I'll leave it at that. So it's important because it's sort of like the alphabet. Second of all, when you're learning these things, it might help speed things up if you don't just memorize them, but you have a mnemonic, so you have a little memory trick, and that'll speed up your learning. So I'll try to point those out as we go along. It doesn't even have to be a trick. If it makes sense to you, you'll learn it faster. If it doesn't make sense, it won't be fun. All right, and it'll take longer. So next, experience and association. So you don't have to even actively try to memorize these, like sit down for 2 minutes or 5 minutes or whatever and try to memorize them. If you're encountering this frequently, like let's say you're doing 10 questions, 30 questions, 100 questions, you're seeing this every day in school, you're going to end up learning these terms anyway. So I would say get familiar with them and then you'll slowly just pick them up as you go. So that's what I mean by just through experience and sort of subconscious association. Every time you see these terms, you'll see certain configurations, you'll know what they mean. All right, next, exercise. So it's sort of like exercise. If you're not very physically fit, you can't do advanced exercises. This is the equivalent of just knowing how to do a squat or a push-up or a pull-up or being able to jog for 5 minutes or swim. If you can't do those things, you have no business adding weight or playing like some crazy sports like football or something. You have to know the basics first. So these are just the basics. I'm not going to dwell on these. In fact, I really don't care that much about teaching this sort of stuff, but I just want to sort of set it up so we don't just jump into the deep end, so you guys have there's some introduction to these terms. All right, so that's all I'm going to say there. Also, this stuff can be useful not just to know the names, but to know the setup. So the names aren't even important. It's just to know that is this sort of setup. And we'll go over what they mean in a second. So we talked in the previous video about the importance of top-down versus bottom-up strategies. And also for bottom-up, but particularly for top-down strategies, if you're very comfortable with all these terms, it'll help you visualize strategies when we move on to more complicated problems. So these are like the one step. If you play chess or some other game, if you can't do like a 1-move combination, you can't do a 10-move combination. So these are like your 1-move combinations. All right, so that's all I'll say for that. Let's dive in. So I've called this the Z, sort of like maybe because this looks like a letter Z this way, or if you've seen the movie Zorro or whatever. So this just reminds me of a letter Z because this thing is slanted. Or you could think of it as a railroad track, sort of like a slanted railroad tracks. You have a pair of tracks. So if you're trying to remember this setup, you just need to draw 2 parallel lines and cross them with a line. So that line is called the transversal. And these little tick marks over here indicate that these lines are parallel. If we had another so if I drew another line over here, then I would give these 2 tick marks. So let me just show you what I mean. So if I did that, I would put 2 to indicate that these 2 are parallel, but the reason I've given these 2 is that these are not the same parallel lines as these. So if I had some other set of parallel lines that are going like this, I give each of them 3 arrow marks. All right, so that's a little side note on that. Now, all right, so the transversal is just the line that cuts these parallel lines. And just, this is probably obvious to many of you, but the fact that they're parallel means if you go on infinitely, they're not going to sort of slightly tilt and run into each other. They'll never run into each other. All right, so here I've indicated which angles would be vertical angles. So a vertical angle, the way I remember it is you have a setup like angles 1 and 4. By the way, these are not the values. I've just labeled them 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So for vertical angles, it would be any angles that if you flip it, you get the opposite angle on the other side. So we could think of it this way. 1 and 2 give us a straight line together. So together these two angles are 180 degrees. Together 2 and 4 are 180 degrees. So therefore, these two must be the same because the angle 1 plus angle 2 is 180, angle 2 plus angle 4 is 180. So what's the common denominator? It's these two angles. So they both must be contributing the same thing to angle 2. So angle 1 is the same as angle 4. That's a pair of vertical angles. So anytime you have a setup like this, these angles will be the same, as will these angles. Now, these aren't the only set of vertical angles, so we have angles 2 and 3, also vertical angles. We have 6 and 7, 5 and 8. So that's just, you should just memorize that's a vertical angle setup. Okay, now alternate interior. And again, for vertical, don't memorize the names. It makes sense because if you draw two lines, the vertical angles are literally vertically across from each other. So that's what it means to be vertical angles. Alternate, what does alternate mean? It means on either side. So interior would be the inside of these railroad tracks. The exterior would be over here. So alternate means we're not on the same side of the transversal. So we're not 4 and 6, but rather we're 3 and 6. So alternate, so the 3 is on to the left, the 6 is to the right, and we're on the inside. So 3 and 6 happen to be the same value. Why is that? Maybe you can convince yourself. These both look like they're the small angles, and that stems from the fact that these lines are parallel. These aren't the only alternate interior angles. We have 4 and 5 is the other pair of alternate interior angles. So let's move on. Corresponding angles. What that means is the setup corresponds. So like if you take your hand, let's say angle 2, if you just slide this down, boom, that's 6. That corresponds. We could also do with angles 1 and 5. You take 1, you just shift it down, it's like the same thing, right? So 1 and 5. We can also do that with 3 and 7. So you take this thing, move it down, 3 and 7. 4 and 8. So all those pairs have the same values. Next, alternate exterior angles. Again, alternate means on either side of this transversal, and exterior means exterior to these tracks. So that means here. So 1 and 8 would be on the outside, on exterior, and you could tell visually they look like they have the same value, and indeed they do, as do 2 and 7. All right, so I'm going to leave this part there. So anytime you see the setup immediately, and in fact in this setup, angles, I should emphasize this, but angles 1, 4, 5, and 8 all have the same value, and angles 2, 3, 6, and 7 all have the same value. So you basically only have 2 different angles and repetitions of it all over in that diagram. All right, next. These are terms that pop up, so you should be familiar with them. Complementary and supplementary. So if 2 angles are complementary, that means they sum to 90 degrees. If 2 angles are supplementary, it means they sum to 180 degrees. So here's an example of complementary. So let's say A is like 30 degrees, B is 60 degrees. Together, they make up 90 degrees. This little indication I have here, right, let me just make this red. This thing that I've drawn, that thing indicates that this is a 90-degree angle. So anytime let's say you have a square or a rectangle, anytime I do this, indicates that all of these are 90-degree angles. All right. Supplementary means they add up to 180. So angles, let's say 1 and 2, add up to 180, 3 and 4, 180, 2 and 4, 1 and 3, 5 and 6, 6 and 8, 8 and 7, 7. Anything that adds up to a line is going to be supplementary. Now, I know I had trouble with this, and maybe many of you have trouble remembering. You know these terms, but you maybe forget which one is which. So the little mnemonic I have for remembering this is in the English alphabet, C comes before S, and 90 is smaller than 180. So the smaller alphabet letter has the smaller value. The C has the 90, the S has the 180. All right. Now make sure you don't, by the way, just a little side English note. If you're going to spell complementary, don't put an I here. That is a different word. That means to compliment someone, like to give them to tell them something nice. So while A and B are next to each other and they add up to 90, they're not necessarily saying nice things about each other. So they're not complimentary, they're complementary. All right, so that's all I have to say for today about the Z or railroad track setup. Hopefully that helps orient you to all these terms, and we're going to jump into some more fun geometry stuff in the next few videos. See you guys.